I've spent 32 years stitching masterpieces that bear other people's names, my hands creating artistry worth millions while I remain invisible, like supporting threads that hold every tapestry together but never appear in the final image. My fingers have crafted 4,873 textile designs, generating $4.2 million in revenue, the same fingers that administered my husband's Parkinson's medication 200 times, moving from silk to pill bottles with identical precision and invisibility. The hollow feeling hit first emptiness, carving inside my chest, fingertips tingling with numbness as I stood frozen in Prestige Textiles Gallery. Champagne flutes clinked, voices echoed off marble floors, but time suspended as I stared at my distinctive crosshatch variation, developed after 3 years of research into 17th century French techniques, displayed under spotlight with Jacob Morrison's name beside it. His innovative approach revolutionized our spring collection, Trevor announced to the gathered crowd. The precision of these stitches simply didn't exist in contemporary textiles before Jacob's breakthrough. A bitter metallic taste flooded my mouth as someone bumped into me without a glance. Just another wall fixture, not the architect of the beauty surrounding us. I'd spent 450 that crosshatch technique. Trevor had stood in my workspace 14 months ago watching me demonstrate it, nodding appreciatively before taking my sample to show the marketing team. My hands, the instruments that had given birth to thousands of designs, betrayed me now, trembling so violently I had to clasp them together, knuckles whitening. I slipped my fingers into my pockets, a habit perfected years ago. No one notices the invisible woman hiding her shaking hands. The Montgomery collection truly cements our position as industry innovators, Trevor continued, gesturing toward 5 of my textiles displayed with others' names. My phone vibrated. A text from my stepdaughter. Need to talk about Dad's things. Daniel's brought an appraiser for the tapestries. We're all waiting at the house. The tapestries, my husband's grandmother's heirlooms I'd spent over 300 hours meticulously restoring, researching extinct techniques to match original craftsmanship. They had hung in our living room for 12 years, preserved through expertise no one had bothered to acknowledge. One moment in the gallery, the next outside, lungs burning with evening air that smelled of approaching rain. A younger designer, whose career I'd quietly nurtured, walked past without recognition, laughing about the amazing opportunity Trevor had just offered her. 28 minutes later, I stood in my dining room watching stepson Daniel unfold appraisal documents across the table. I'd restored myself, the family dinner I'd prepared, as I had for countless gatherings during 15 years of marriage and 7 years since my husband's death, grew cold on the sideboard, the scent of rosemary chicken fading into the background just like me. Now that we've got the paperwork sorted, we'll collect the tapestries next weekend, Daniel said without looking up. They belong with the family. The water glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against hardwood. The sound rippled through my body like a shockwave. The Prescott Heritage Foundation confirmed their museum-quality pieces, he continued, still not looking at me. Grandmother's eye for quality, you know. I restored those tapestries, I said, my voice sounding strange. They were disintegrating when I found them. Lena's laugh was light, dismissive. Oh, Sophia, don't be dramatic. They just needed cleaning. I spent over 300 hours researching and reconstructing the original techniques, the Valenciennes stitch alone. Mom, Daniel interrupted, using the term he only employed when wanting something. They're family heirlooms. Dad would want them preserved properly. I preserved them, I said, voice already fading to its habitual softness, that trailing off perfected over decades of interruption. The point is, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, these belong with blood relatives who can appreciate their history. Blood relatives. The words pierced something vital. After 15 years of marriage, after 8,760 hours of night monitoring during illness, After spending $897,000 of retirement savings on experimental treatments, still just a temporary caretaker, my hands trembled again, just as at the gallery. In one day, both worlds I'd poured my life into revealed the truth I'd hidden from myself. I was invisible, a ghost leaving behind creations others claimed, preserving treasures others owned. Daniel's right, Lena added with practiced sympathy. You should be focusing on memories now, Sophia, not possessions. At your age, it's time to simplify. At my age, I was 58, not 98. Yet, they spoke as if my life were already behind me, as if all that remained was to fade quietly into background, continue being the invisible thread holding their lives together without recognition. My wrist ached suddenly, the repetitive strain from decades of detailed handwork. Doctors had suggested I find a less demanding hobby, never understanding my livelihood and passion were one. Now pain shot up my arm, a physical severing from my own creations. But threads always tell the truth. As I stood amid shards of broken glass, something stirred beneath my ribs, not hollow emptiness, but a tightening like a loom being warped, threads pulled taut for something new. What they didn't know, for 32 years, I documented every design, every technique in meticulous journals hidden in my studio. For decades, I'd woven evidence of my existence, waiting for the pattern to finally reveal itself. I bent down for a glass shard, felt its edge against my keyless fingertip, not sharp enough to cut skin, toughened by thousands of tiny wounds, endured creating beauty. Others claimed. The trembling in my hands suddenly stilled, as if my body knew before my mind that everything was about to change. My first day at Prestige Textiles remains etched in my memory, like a perfectly executed chain stitch, precise, vibrant, full of possibility. Sunlight streaming through tall windows caught dust motes dancing like golden threads, waiting to be woven. The scent of raw silk and linen mingled with sizing and dye. At 26, my fingers were nimble and unscarred, eager to translate the patterns in my mind into tangible beauty. You have exceptional technical skill, my first supervisor said, examining my portfolio. Your understanding of historical techniques is remarkable for someone so young. I stood straighter, pride warming my chest. I've been studying 16th and 17th century embroidery since 14. There's wisdom in those old methods that can be adapted for contemporary applications. She nodded appreciatively. We need someone with your technical expertise. The designers have ideas, but they need someone who can make them structurally sound. I didn't understand then what she was truly saying, that I would be the invisible foundation upon which others would build their reputations, that my technical expertise would forever be separated from real design in the company hierarchy. Within 3 years, I developed a modernized petit point technique that reduced production time by 37% while maintaining the intricate detail that made Prestige Textiles sought after. The company implemented my innovation across their luxury line, generating an additional $840,000 in revenue that first year alone. My reward, a crystal paperweight and $1,200 holiday bonus. This is revolutionary, the production manager said, examining my samples. We'll incorporate this immediately into the Palmer collection. At the collection launch 6 months later, my name appeared nowhere, not in promotional materials, not in press releases, not in interviews where Jeffrey Palmer spoke about his innovative approach to traditional techniques. I stood in the corner, champagne growing warm in my hand, as Jeffrey accepted compliments for my work. My shoulders hunched almost imperceptibly, the first physical manifestation of an emotional posture I would maintain for decades. That's just how the industry works, Margot told me that night over tea that smelled of jasmine and truth. We'd met at a textile conservation workshop and bonded over our shared obsession with preserving historical techniques. The technical people never get the glory. I'm not looking for glory, I insisted. though something tight and uncomfortable settled in my stomach. I just want acknowledgement of my contribution. Margot's eyes held both sympathy and knowing. In this business, women like us are expected to be grateful just to be in the room. I didn't listen. I kept believing exceptional work would eventually speak for itself, that dedication and expertise would inevitably be recognized. For decades, I held this belief like a talisman, even as evidence mounted to the contrary. When I met Daniel Sr. at a museum fundraiser 16 years into my career, I was still waiting for recognition. He was charming, established, appreciative of my knowledge in a way colleagues never seemed to be. When he asked questions about textile conservation, he actually listened, nodded thoughtfully, asked follow-ups showing genuine interest. "You speak about these pieces as if they're alive," he said, gesturing to a 17th century tapestry fragment I'd been explaining. "They are alive," I told him, running my fingers just above the delicate fibers. "Each tells a story, not just in the image, but in how it was made." The tension reveals the weaver's state of mind. Tighter sections indicate stress or concentration. Looser areas suggest confidence or fatigue. He looked at me with something like wonder. "I've been on the museum board for 7 years, and I've never heard anyone explain it that way." 4 months later, we married. His children, Daniel Jr., 22, and Lena, 19, were coolly polite at the wedding. I understood their reservation and didn't push, believing time would build genuine connections. When Daniel was diagnosed with Parkinson's 3 years into our marriage, the subtle shift in family dynamic calcified. I became his caregiver, a role his children seemed to consider my primary purpose all along. "We're so grateful Dad has you to take care of things," Lena would say during increasingly infrequent visits, patting my hand without meeting my eyes. "It's such a blessing that your job is so flexible." My job wasn't flexible. I worked full days at the design studio, then came home to manage Daniel's increasingly complex care. I administered medications, modified our home for his changing mobility, researched experimental treatments, tracking symptoms with the same meticulous attention I gave my design journals. When a promising trial opened in Switzerland, I withdrew $187,000 from my retirement account to cover costs. The treatment offered 6 additional months of improved mobility, months when Daniel could still feed himself, still hold my hand, still recognize his children when they visited. "You really don't need to spend your money on this," Daniel Jr. said when I mentioned the financial arrangements. "Dad has plenty." "We're married," I said simply. "What's mine is his." What I didn't say, Daniel Sr. had updated his will, leaving the house and most assets directly to his children. "They're young," he'd explained. "They'll need security. You have your career, your talent. You'll always be able to take care of yourself." I didn't argue, though my career had stagnated at $42,000 annually for 11 years while younger designers I trained were promoted above me. Alone in our bedroom that night, I pressed my face into Daniel's pillow, inhaling the medicinal scent that had replaced his cologne, and allowed myself 5 minutes of silent tears before returning to my caregiver's smile. This vulnerability, this momentary breaking remained my secret ritual, hidden from everyone including my husband. Jacob Morrison, now taking credit for my crosshatch technique, came to Prestige fresh from design school 6 years ago. For months, I guided his hands through complex stitching patterns, corrected his tension issues, taught him how to create structural integrity, allowing his aesthetic ideas to function in production. "You have such a knack for this," he'd said, watching me demonstrate a difficult technique. "It comes so naturally to you." Not natural, never natural. My expertise was built through 32 years of study, practice, and innovation, thousands of hours of dedicated work reduced to a knack in a single dismissive phrase. The condescension wasn't limited to work. After Daniel passed, his children began questioning my decisions about our shared home. "Do you really need such a big house now that you're alone?" Lena asked just 3 months after the funeral, her words chilling the air between us. "This dining table really should stay in the family," Daniel Jr. commented when noticing me refinishing it. "It's been passed down for generations." Each comment was a tiny pinprick, barely noticeable alone, but collectively forming a pattern of erasure as deliberate as any embroidery design. Each dismissal tightened something inside me. A thread pulled too taut, threatening to snap with mounting tension. What they never saw, what no one ever saw, was that while I appeared to accept treatment with quiet dignity, I was meticulously documenting everything. Every design I created went into journals with dated sketches, thread samples, and technique notes. Every family heirloom I restored was photographed before and after, with detailed records of hours, materials, and historical research. That night, after the dual betrayals at work and home, I began seeing the full design of what had happened all along. My hands trembled pulling out leather-bound journals from their hiding place. 32 years of evidence, 32 years of creation, 32 years of being written out of my own story. My wrist throbbed with familiar ache as I opened the oldest volume, pain radiating to my shoulder, a body keeping score of all I had given and how little I had received in return. I didn't sleep. How could I, with both worlds I'd built crumbling simultaneously? Instead, I sat cross-legged on my studio floor, surrounded by journals, lost in a landscape of my own creation that no one else had ever truly seen. Around 3 a.m, I opened my laptop to check if Prestige had published the press release about the anniversary collection, the one that would once again erase me. The search pulled up their sleek website, Revolutionary Textile Innovation, the Montgomery Collection. I clicked, each pixel another needle prick, to my composure. The page loaded with glamorous photos of my designs, modeled by willowy figures draped in fabrics I had structured and brought to life. I scrolled automatically, a masochistic impulse to witness my own erasure, when a notification popped up, an email from Trevor to the entire design team, except me. My name missing from the distribution list. But Caroline's name was there, my assistant who'd accidentally copied me on her reply. Draft text for the commemorative book, the original email read. Final images, inserted by week's end. Publication date set for next month to coincide with the Montgomery Collection's international launch. I opened the attached PDF with hands suddenly gone still, as if my body knew before my mind that everything was about to change. Prestige Innovations, 5 decades of textile excellence. I skimmed past the introductory chapter, scrolling until a familiar pattern caught my eye. There, displayed across a full page, was my Petit Point adaptation, the one that had increased their revenue by $840,000 in its first year. The caption read, "Jeffrey Palmer's revolutionary Petit Point technique reduced production time while maintaining Prestige's signature quality." My lungs collapsed, air refusing to enter. This wasn't just taking credit for recent work. This was systematic historical revision. They were erasing me, not just from the present, but from the company's entire history. With trembling fingers, I continued. There was my Marseille-inspired lattice work, credited to Amanda Walters. My couched gold work technique, attributed to Richard Bennett. My crosshatch variation, the most recent theft, presented as Jacob Morrison's breakthrough innovation. But what shattered me was a memo buried at the end. Clearly not meant for publication. Note: Technical Contributors section to be removed from final draft. Legal has advised against creating a documented history of non-designer contributors that could later be used for attribution claims. All technical implementations should be credited to the lead designer for each collection. Technical contributors. That's what I was after 32 years. A footnote they were deliberately erasing to protect themselves legally. A sound escaped me, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, as ice water poured down my spine. Technical contributor, temporary caretaker. always adjacent to what mattered, never centered in my own life. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The hollow feeling in my chest transformed into something solid and weighty, as if the empty space suddenly filled with molten metal, heavy and burning but somehow stabilizing. My breathing deepened, deliberate. Even the persistent ache in my wrist receded as blood rushed hot through my veins. I set the laptop aside and turned back to my journals with new purpose. These weren't just personal records, they were evidence. 32 years of dated entries, material samples, technical notes, and progression photos. I had documented everything, not because I anticipated theft, but because that's who I am. Meticulous, thorough, the invisible thread that holds everything together. With clear eyes, I began to see my journals as something more powerful than private remembrances. They were a counter-narrative to the fiction Prestige was constructing. They were proof. I opened the leather-bound volume from 203 and found my original Petit Point adaptation sketches. Each drawing dated, thread samples included, 16 failed attempts documented before the breakthrough. I even had the original production notes, with Jeffrey Palmer's signature acknowledging receipt of my technical specifications. For hours, I recontextualized what I'd always seen as personal record-keeping. In my hands, these journals transformed from private documentation into irrefutable evidence. The weight of them, the physical presence of decades of erased contributions, felt suddenly significant in a way I hadn't recognized before. Dawn was breaking when I reached for my phone and opened the camera. I began photographing pages systematically, creating digital copies of the most compelling evidence. My hands, which had trembled with shock earlier, now moved with surgical precision. There was strange power in this methodical documentation of documentation, a meta-record of my existence that could no longer be erased. The scent of morning dew filtered through the slightly open window, replacing the stale air of night and revelation. I inhaled deeply, as if breathing in possibility itself. Technical contributors section to be removed. The words echoed, fueling something new. Not just anger, but righteous indignation. Not just hurt, but clarity. I typed into my browser, copyright laws, textile design attribution, then intellectual property rights for employed designers, then textile authentication experts. The last search brought up several professional associations, including the Textile Arts Guild and their authentication services. Among their featured experts was a familiar name, Margot Chen, textile conservator and authentication specialist, my old friend, who had warned me decades ago about the industry's treatment of technical people. Margot, who had gone independent while I stayed loyal to a company that never returned that loyalty. I clicked on her profile. She had established her own conservation studio and now served as a consultant to museums and private collectors, specializing in attribution authentication and provenance establishment for historical and contemporary textiles. My phone felt suddenly weighty. Calling Margot would be crossing a line, moving from private realization to public action. Once crossed, there would be no returning to the invisible woman I had been. The thought sent a shiver through me, not entirely unpleasant. Before I could reconsider, I pressed her number. It was barely 7 in the morning, but Margot had always been an early riser. "Sophia Mercer," she answered warmly, skipping hello. "It's been too long. What's prompted this early morning call after, 2 years? I need your professional opinion," I said, voice steadier than expected. "On textile authentication and attribution." A pause. "This sounds serious. Does this have anything to do with that commemorative book Prestige is publishing? I heard rumors about it at the conservation conference last month." The fact that she immediately connected my call to the book, that rumors of my erasure were circulating in professional circles, made my chest tighten. "They're publishing my work under other people's names," I said simply. "Not just recent work, everything, for decades." Oh, Sophia. Her voice softened with a sadness that held no surprise. Do you have documentation? 32 years worth. Every design, every technique, dated and detailed, and you're finally ready to do something about it. Not a question, a recognition. Yes, the word emerged with such certainty it startled me. Yes, I was ready. After decades of invisibility, I was ready to be seen. Bring your documentation to my studio tomorrow, Margot said. And Sophia, bring the most egregious examples first. The ones where the evidence is irrefutable. I faced an impossible choice: pursue justice and risk everything I'd built professionally, or remain silent and continue my slow erasure. Neither path offered safety, neither promised peace, but only one offered truth. After we hung up, I sat in the strengthening morning light, surrounded by physical evidence of my existence that had been hidden away too long. The revelation wasn't just that I had been systematically erased. I had always known that on some level, the true revelation was that I had been complicit in my own erasure by remaining silent, by accepting that this was simply how the industry works. I ran my fingers over my oldest journal, feeling leather worn smooth by decades of handling. For the first time, I saw these books not as private records, but as a tapestry of evidence I had been unconsciously weaving for 32 years. Thread by thread, entry by entry, I had been creating the means of my own vindication without realizing it. Some patterns only reveal themselves with time, I whispered, my voice no longer trailing off, but firm and clear. The phrase that had been my mantra of patience had transformed into a declaration of power. I stood, feeling a strange new sensation coursing through my body, spine straightening, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting. My reflection in the studio window showed a woman I barely recognized, not hunched, not diminished, but expansive. I picked up my phone and opened my calendar. With deliberate precision, I deleted my scheduled design review with Trevor. In its place, I created a new appointment. Begin reclamation. Threads always tell the truth, and it was finally time for my truth to be told. Margot's studio occupied the third floor of a converted textile mill, flooded with natural light that made the dust motes dance like they had in Prestige's windows decades ago. I arrived carrying my 5 most compelling journals, finding her arranging photography equipment. You look different, she said, studying my face. After decades of dressing to fade, muted colors, simple lines, I'd chosen a silk blouse in deep crimson. For the first time in years, my hands were ungloved, calluses and needle scars, visible testimony to my expertise. I feel different, I admitted, the words settling in my chest like a cornerstone. Margot nodded. Show me. For 3 hours, we documented everything. She photographed my journal entries alongside Prestige published designs, creating side-by-sides that made the theft undeniable. This crosshatch variation, she said, examining my 2021 entry next to Jacob Morrison's revolutionary design. The tension distribution is unmistakable. No one else uses this configuration. It's my signature, I explained, tracing the pattern with my bare finger. The sensation sent a ripple of memory through my body, thousands of hours perfecting this technique, my fingertips remembering what my mind had created. The structure creates both flexibility and stability, something Trevor said was impossible when I proposed it. Margot looked up. And now it's the centerpiece of their anniversary collection. This isn't borrowing inspiration, Sophia. This is systematic theft of intellectual property. The words hung between us. Stark, validating, theft. Not borrowing, not inspiration. Theft. What happens now? I asked, my hands trembling with anticipation. Now we contact Victoria Kingsley, the textile historian, who's also a former intellectual property attorney specializing in design attribution and the owner of Kingsley Gallery, hosting an exhibition on innovation in textile arts next month, directly competing with Prestige's book launch. 2 days later, I sat across from Victoria in her gallery office, watching her methodically review our evidence. Her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a severe bun, she examined page after page with the scent of archival paper and preservation chemicals hanging in the air. Finally, she looked up. "I've seen hundreds of attribution disputes, Ms. Mercer. Rarely have I encountered documentation this comprehensive." I nodded briefly. Decades of being interrupted had taught me to keep responses brief. "Do you understand what you have here?" Victoria continued, tapping my oldest journal. "This isn't just evidence of stolen designs. This is a documented history of innovation that museums would value." Her suggestion caught me off guard. I had thought only of correction, having my name properly attached to my work. Prestige publishes their commemorative book next month. Victoria continued, "Timing will be crucial." "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "A counter-narrative." "My exhibition opens 2 weeks before their book launch. What if we included your work and documentation side by side?" My breath caught. "You want to publicly display my journals?" "I want to display your genius," she corrected. "The systematic innovation that Prestige has been erasing for 3 decades. The possibility unfolded, not just private vindication, but public recognition. Would that jeopardize any legal claims?" I asked. Victoria smiled. "Quite the opposite. Public attribution by recognized experts strengthens your position should you pursue damages. But first, let's establish your rightful place in textile history." As I left the gallery, my phone buzzed with Trevor's text. "Where were you for the design review? Jacob needed your technical input on the Montgomery crosshatch." The casual entitlement, expecting me to help implement a design stolen from me, sent heat rising up my neck for the first time in my career. I didn't respond. At a nearby cafe, Caroline was already waiting, nervously shredding a napkin. "I shouldn't be meeting you," she whispered. "Trevor was furious when you missed the review." "Did he say anything specific?" I asked casually. "He said they might need to accelerate your retirement plans. They're announcing staff changes after the book launch. Jacob's being promoted to design director. Of course, using my innovation to advance while I was being pushed out." "I'm sorry," Caroline whispered. "It's not right." Her solidarity loosened something in my chest. "No, it's not. But it's not your responsibility to fix it." "What will you do?" she asked. "I'm exploring my options," I said carefully. Caroline glanced around, then pulled out her phone. "That's why I brought this." She showed an email from Trevor. "Contingency plans, Mercer transition." My fingers trembled as I read how the company planned to extract my knowledge before transitioning me to retirement. "They're planning to drain you dry, then discard you," Caroline said, indignant. I returned her phone, unexpectedly calm. "Thank you for showing me this." She hesitated. "There's something else." The company's server archives all emails, including the ones about removing technical contributors from the commemorative book. "Caroline, accessing those could risk your job. Some things matter more than job security." She met my eyes. "You taught me everything I know, Sophia." "Not Jacob, not Trevor. You. And they're erasing that too." Alone in my studio that evening, I created a document titled Reclamation Strategy, outlining my next steps. Complete documentation, authentication with finalize exhibition plan with Victoria. Opening and select signature pieces. Focus on the 5 most egregious thefts. Continue attending work normally. To maintain access, prepare formal demand letter with Victoria's attorney. My phone rang, Lena's name flashing on screen. "Daniel and I have been talking," she began. "We feel terrible about the other night. We never meant to upset you." Her tone was conciliatory, but rang false. The same practiced sympathy she'd used when telling me it was time to simplify at my age. "That's why instead of taking all the tapestries, Why don't we start with just the two from the dining room, Dad's favorites? The compromise was so transparent I almost laughed. They still wanted the tapestries with my blessing. I need more time to consider the collection as a whole, I said evenly. Sophia, Lena's voice sharpened. They're family heirlooms. They belong with blood relatives. There it was again. Blood relatives. As if my 15 years of marriage, my care for their father, my resurrection of these tapestries counted for nothing. These tapestries represent hundreds of hours of my professional expertise. I need to consider their proper attribution and valuation. Attribution? Lena repeated. They're not your creations, Sophia. They're restorations at best. The dismissal of restoration, the diminishment of my skill, was so familiar it almost didn't sting. Almost. We'll discuss this after I've completed my assessment, I said firmly, ending the call. I added a new item. 6. Obtain professional appraisal of tapestry restoration work. That night, I stayed up late in my studio with materials I hadn't touched in years, threads in sapphire blue, deep crimson, burnished gold, so different from the muted palette I'd used to fade into the background. On fresh canvas, I began creating a tapestry, telling my own story, using every technique stolen from me. Each stitch was both evidence and reclamation. As my fingers moved, memories flowed through them, my body remembering what my mind had created, the physical wisdom of thousands of hours of work surging through my hands. The metallic threads caught the lamplight, transforming from mere material into testament. As dawn broke, I stepped back. The emerging pattern was just beginning, but already I could see the power in it. The undeniable signature of my hand, marking it irrefutably as mine. This would be the centerpiece of Victoria's exhibition. Not just evidence of theft, but proof of authorship. Not just reclamation of past, but declaration of future. I ran my ungloved, expert hands over the work, feeling the texture beneath my fingertips. For the first time in decades, I was creating something that would bear my name from the beginning. Threads always tell the truth, I whispered, the phrase transformed from resignation to affirmation. And it's time my threads told mine. The day before Victoria's exhibition opening, Trevor called me into his office. I went calmly, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. Sophia, Trevor gestured to the chair across from his desk, his smile not reaching his eyes. I wanted to discuss your absence from several critical meetings recently. I sat, noting how his walls displayed framed collections I had helped create, my invisible threads holding together the very fabric of his success. I've been focused on completing the Montgomery collection specifications, I said, not entirely untrue. I had been working just not for prestige's benefit. Jacob has expressed concerns about your engagement with his innovative techniques. He feels you're resistant to implementing his crosshatch variation correctly. The audacity almost took my breath away. Jacob was complaining I wasn't properly implementing my own stolen technique. I've been studying Jacob's approach, I said carefully. It's remarkably similar to historical techniques I've worked with. Trevor's expression tightened. A microscopic narrowing around the eyes, a slight hardening at the jaw. Jacob's innovation is entirely contemporary. This resistance to new methods is exactly why we're considering structural changes to the technical department. I nodded, my face a mask of practiced neutrality perfected over decades. I understand. Change is inevitable. I'm glad you see it that way. Relief flickered across his features. We value your contributions, Sophia. We just need to ensure everyone is aligned with the company's forward direction. Everyone should receive proper credit for their contributions. I agreed mildly. In fact, I've been reflecting on my own technical innovations over the years. His eyes narrowed. The company owns all designs created during your employment. That's standard in this industry. Ownership and attribution are different matters, I said, keeping my voice light. I've always been interested in proper historical attribution. Trevor stood abruptly. Let's focus on the immediate priorities. The commemorative book launch is in 3 weeks. I rose as well, suddenly aware of how he'd always used his height to intimidate, another subtle power tactic I'd endured for years without recognition. Of course, I said pleasantly. I've always been dedicated to proper documentation. As I turned to leave, Trevor added with forced casualness, "By the way, there's an industry event tomorrow evening at the Kingsley Gallery, some exhibition opening. The company has decided to send Jacob as our representative." My heart stuttered. They knew. Somehow, they knew about the exhibition. "I see," I managed, keeping my voice neutral. "That sounds appropriate." "Yes." Trevor's smile was cold. "A young, innovative designer seems the right choice to represent prestige." I nodded and left without another word, my mind racing. Had Caroline been discovered? Had Victoria leaked information? It didn't matter. In 24 hours, everything would change regardless. The night of the opening, I arrived at Kingsley Gallery an hour early. Victoria was supervising the final positioning of display cases, while Margot adjusted lighting. "Are you ready?" Victoria asked. The gallery had been transformed into a journey through textile innovation, with historical pieces transitioning into a section titled Contemporary Mastery, The Hidden. In the center lay 5 of my journals, open to pages documenting techniques that matched precisely the prestige designs mounted beside them. The dates on my documentation all clearly preceded prestige innovation. But the true centerpiece was my new creation, the autobiographical tapestry I had been working on day and night. Mounted on the far wall, it combined every signature technique stolen from me over decades, woven into a visual narrative of erasure and emergence. The crimson threads caught the gallery lights, pulsing like blood against the neutral background, my life force finally visible. "I'm ready," I said, surprising myself with my steadiness. Guests began arriving at 7. Victoria's reputation had ensured attendance from museum curators, collectors, and textile experts from across the country. I stayed in the background initially, watching as people moved through the exhibition. The documentation dates precede the commercial releases by years. I overheard one curator murmuring, "Look at the thread samples. They're identical to the production pieces. The structural innovation in this crosshatch technique is remarkable," commented a museum conservator. Whoever created this was decades ahead of the industry. At precisely 8 o'clock, Victoria rang a small bell, gathering everyone before my autobiographical tapestry. "Distinguished guests," she began, "tonight we celebrate not just innovation in textile arts, but the correction of a historical oversight. For too long, the technical foundations of textile design have been separated from creative attribution, allowing certain industry practices that undervalue true innovation." My heart pounded as Jacob entered, his confident expression faltering, as he took in the display cases comparing my documentation to Prestige's published designs. "I'd like to introduce the true innovator behind many of what the industry has called revolutionary techniques," Victoria continued. "A master whose work has been commercially exploited while her name has been systematically erased from the record." She gestured to me, and suddenly all eyes turned in my direction. After decades of invisibility, the attention felt like standing in a spotlight, exposing yet strangely validating. "Sophia Mercer," Victoria announced, "whose contributions to textile innovation have been documented in unprecedented detail, but attributed to others in commercial applications." I moved forward on legs that felt oddly disconnected from my body, hyper-aware of Jacob's stunned expression, of the murmurs rippling through the crowd, of the weight of 3 decades of invisibility suddenly lifting from my shoulders. "Ms. Mercer has generously agreed to demonstrate one of her signature techniques this evening," Victoria concluded, "the distinctive crosshatch variation that forms the centerpiece of Prestige Textiles' upcoming Montgomery collection. A small work table had been set up beside my tapestry. As I took my position, I caught sight of Jacob pushing through the crowd toward Trevor, who had just arrived and was standing frozen at the entrance, his face a mask of controlled shock. I began the demonstration, my hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of hours. This particular crosshatch technique creates both flexibility and stability in the fabric, I explained, my voice growing stronger with each word. The supporting structure allows for complex patterning without compromising durability. The gallery had gone completely silent, all eyes on my hands, as they executed the technique that Jacob had claimed as his breakthrough innovation. I developed this approach in 2021 after studying historical tapestries that employed similar principles, I continued. The evidence of this development process is thoroughly documented in my journals, with dated entries and material samples. From the corner of my eye, I saw Trevor approaching, his expression thunderous. Jacob trailed behind, face flushed with anger or embarrassment. Perhaps both. Ms. Mercer, Trevor's voice cut through the silence, pitched to project professional concern. This is highly inappropriate. As a prestige employee, you're well aware that company innovations belong to the organization, not individuals. I continued my demonstration without pausing, my hands steady. This isn't about ownership, Mr. Harlow. It's about attribution, about historical accuracy. These techniques were developed by our design team, Trevor insisted, his smile tight as he addressed the crowd. While Ms. Mercer's technical contributions were valuable, Prestige Textiles holds all rights to designs created during her employment. Victoria stepped forward. Attribution and rights are different matters, Mr. Harlow. The evidence of Ms. Mercer's innovation, predating your company's claims, is meticulously documented and has been authenticated by multiple independent experts. Trevor's mask slipped, revealing the calculation behind his eyes. We appreciate Ms. Mercer's technical support of our designers' innovations. However, any company materials used in creating these journals would constitute a breach of confidentiality. It was the threat I'd anticipated, claiming my documentation itself was company property. These journals were created on my own time, with my own materials, I said calmly, finally looking up to meet Trevor's gaze directly. Every thread sample, every sketch, every note was documented in my home studio, outside of company hours. A fact I can prove through dated photographs, material receipts, and witness statements spanning 32 years. I set down my work and reached for a pair of white cotton archival gloves. Slipping them on with deliberate care, I walked to the display case containing my oldest journal. But perhaps the most compelling evidence, I continued. Opening the journal to a marked page isn't just in the documentation of techniques, but in the systematic pattern of removing attribution. I looked directly at Trevor as I carefully turned the journal to reveal the email printouts Caroline had provided, the explicit instructions to remove technical contributors from the commemorative book to avoid creating evidence for attribution claims. Trevor's face drained of color. His lips parted in shock, then pressed into a thin white line. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his professional veneer cracking. "That's confidential company communication. It was sent to me by mistake," I said simply. Another instance of invisibility working against you. People tend to forget who's copied on emails when they don't see the recipient as important. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Jacob had edged away from Trevor, clearly trying to distance himself. "You've built your reputation by standing on the shoulders of others, and then erasing the evidence," I continued, my voice steady but carrying to every corner of the gallery. "You've spent decades selling tapestries while making me invisible. I've spent decades documenting every thread. Let's see whose work stands the test of time." The phrase landed with quiet force in the silent gallery. Trevor's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. That's when I noticed Daniel and Lena standing near the entrance, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. With a final glance at Trevor's stunned face, I turned back to the gathered crowd. I removed my gloves deliberately, revealing my hands with their calluses and needle scars, the physical evidence of my expertise. These hands created every stitch that Prestige has claimed as innovation for the past 30 years. I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "I've kept the receipts, Trevor, all of them." The gallery erupted in questions, curators wanting to examine my documentation, collectors inquiring about my independent work, journalists scribbling notes furiously. As the crowd pressed forward, I caught sight of Daniel making his way toward me, Lena following closely behind. "That tapestry," Daniel said, gesturing to my autobiographical piece. "It incorporates the same techniques as the ones in our home." "Yes," I confirmed. "The same techniques I restored in your grandmother's tapestries." "You really are an expert," he said, the realization seeming to land fully for the first time. "A professional at the top of your field." "I always have been," I replied without rancor. "You just never saw it." Victoria appeared at my side. "Sophia, the curator from the Metropolitan Museum, is asking about acquisition of your documentation for their textile history archives, and several collectors are inquiring about commissioning original pieces." As Victoria led me away, I glanced back to see Trevor engaged in intense conversation with Prestige's legal counsel, who had apparently been summoned to the gallery. Their body language told me everything. Damage control was already underway. The next morning, I received 3 calls before 9 in the morning. One from Victoria, reporting that the exhibition had generated unprecedented interest, with 2 museums requesting to host it. One from my attorney, noting that Prestige's legal team had reached out about a mutually beneficial resolution, and one from Lena, asking if we could meet to discuss the family tapestries. I answered only Victoria's call. There would be time for the others later. I drove to Prestige Textiles one last time. Caroline met me at reception, her eyes wide. "Everyone's talking about the exhibition," she whispered. "Jacob didn't come in today." I nodded, unsurprised. "I've come to collect my personal items." Caroline walked me to my workspace, the small windowless room where I'd created innovations worth millions while earning a salary of $42,000. I had few personal belongings there. Most of my true work had always happened in my home studio. As I packed, Trevor appeared in the doorway, his face drawn, his usual confidence replaced by careful calculation. "The board would like to discuss terms," he said without preamble. "They're prepared to offer proper attribution in the commemorative book and a senior designer title with appropriate compensation adjustment." I continued packing methodically. "Proper attribution would mean removing other people's names from my work, Trevor. Are you prepared to tell Jacob and the others that they'll no longer be credited with my innovations?" His silence was answer enough. "I'm not interested in negotiating for recognition I should have received decades ago," I said calmly, closing my box. "My attorney will be in touch regarding the theft of intellectual property and the deliberate attempt to erase attribution." "Sophia," Trevor's voice took on an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. "Be reasonable. A public dispute would damage everyone involved. You've made your point with the exhibition." I finally looked at him directly, struck by how small he suddenly appeared, how dependent his power had always been on others' silence. "This isn't about making a point," I said quietly. "It's about correcting the record. Threads always tell the truth, Trevor. I'm just making sure everyone can finally see the pattern." I walked past him, carrying my small box. Caroline waited by the elevator, her expression a mixture of awe and anxiety. "What will you do now?" she asked, as the doors opened. I stepped inside, then turned to face her. "I'm going to create something new, something that bears my name from the beginning." As the elevator doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the design floor where I'd spent 32 years being invisible. I felt no regret, just a profound sense of a chapter ending and another beginning. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A message from Victoria. The Metropolitan agreed to your terms. They want your complete documentation archive and the autobiographical tapestry as the centerpiece of their textile innovation exhibition next spring. Full attribution, of course. I set down my box and absorbed the magnitude of this reversal. For decades, my work had been displayed without my name. Now my name would be displayed in one of the world's premier museums, attached permanently to my work. That afternoon, Prestige issued a press release announcing a restructuring of the design attribution process and the indefinite postponement of their commemorative book. By evening, 3 industry publications had requested interviews about my groundbreaking textile authentication techniques. The threads that had been invisible for so long were finally visible to everyone. The pattern of my life had transformed from erasure to emergence, and for the first time in 32 years, I was fully seen. 6 months after the exhibition that changed everything, I stood in my transformed studio, once a cramped back room, now the heart of my home. Morning light streamed through new floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space 3 times its original size after removing walls that once separated it from the main living area. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. No more hiding in corners, no more separation between my expertise and the rest of my life. My work table dominated the center of the room, no longer shoved against a wall. Around it, display cases showcased works in progress, each bearing my signature in deliberate, visible stitching. The walls held framed exhibition catalogs from the Metropolitan Museum, the Textile Arts Guild, and 3 international galleries that had featured my work. Most importantly, the room held the distinct scent of new creation, silk, linen, and cotton fibers mixed with the subtle aroma of beeswax I used to condition my threads. The smell of purpose, of freedom, so different from the medicinal scent that had permeated my life during Daniel's illness, so different from the sterile atmosphere of Prestige's design room. The settlement with Prestige had been finalized 3 months ago. $1.2 million in compensation, full attribution in all company materials, including the rewritten commemorative book, and a formal public apology. I'd used the money to create this studio and establish the Mercer Textile Preservation Fund for apprenticing conservators. My phone chimed with a calendar reminder. Authentication consultation, 11 a.m. I smiled, remembering how I'd once kept my expertise hidden, diminished, undervalued. Now museums and private collectors paid $3,500 for that same expertise, not as a technical contribution, but as authoritative authentication. The doorbell rang precisely at 11. I moved through my home with a new physicality, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, steps deliberate and unhurried. The woman at my door wasn't the same one who had stood frozen and invisible at Prestige's anniversary celebration. That woman had disappeared along with the gloves I'd once used to hide my hands. "Miss Mercer," the museum representative said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Bennett from the Textile Heritage Foundation. Thank you for making time for this consultation." I led her to my studio, enjoying her small gasp of appreciation. On my work table lay the tapestry fragment she'd brought for authentication, purportedly an 18th century French piece. "This is quite an honor," Dr. Bennett said, glancing at the Metropolitan Exhibition catalog. "Your authentication methods have become the gold standard in the field." I nodded, accepting the compliment without deflection, another habit I'd broken. "Let's examine your piece." For the next hour, I demonstrated my authentication process, pointing out the structural elements that revealed the true origin. The tensioning technique suggests Northern Italian influence rather than French, and the dye composition is consistent with early 19th century practices, not 18th century as previously attributed. Dr. Bennett took notes rapidly. "Would you be willing to document this assessment formally?" The foundation would acknowledge your authentication in all future displays and publications. Of course, I said, already reaching for my documentation materials. How different from the days when my assessments were stripped of attribution the moment they left my hands. After Dr. Bennett departed, I prepared for my next appointment, a more personal consultation. The family tapestries that had once hung in my living room now occupied my studio, laid out for examination. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Lena standing uncomfortably on my porch, Daniel beside her.
"Thank you for agreeing to meet," Daniel said,
his tone formal but lacking its former condescension. I welcomed them in, noting how their eyes widened at the transformation of the home they'd once suggested I should leave because it was too big for someone alone. "Your home looks different," Lena managed, taking in the vibrant textiles now adorning the walls, all my own creations, bold where once there had been only family photographs. "I've made some changes," I said simply, leading them to the studio. They fell silent at the sight of the family tapestries displayed under proper conservation lighting, with documentation materials arranged beside each piece. "I've completed the authentication and valuation you requested," I told them, indicating my formal assessment. "These pieces are indeed 18th century French work. However, the extensive restoration I performed constitutes approximately 60% of their current material composition and structural integrity." Daniel picked up my detailed documentation. The appraisal values them at $98,000 each. "That's their current market value," I confirmed. "Without the restoration work, they would have been worth less than $15,000 each if they survived at all." "We didn't understand," Lena said quietly, "the extent of what you'd done, what it was worth." I regarded her steadily, neither accusatory nor accommodating. "Most people don't understand the value of preservation until something is nearly lost." Daniel set down the documentation. "We came to discuss a different arrangement. After seeing your exhibition, after finally understanding your professional standing, we realized we've been I waited, saying nothing. After decades of filling uncomfortable silences, I had learned the power of allowing them to expand. "We'd like to propose that you retain custody of the tapestries," Daniel continued, "with formal acknowledgement of your restoration work. They clearly belong with someone who understands their true value." The concession was significant, but still framed as their decision, their generosity. The old me might have accepted this partial recognition gratefully. The woman I had become recognized it as yet another form of control. "I appreciate the gesture," I said carefully, "but I'm no longer interested in custody arrangements for my professional work. I've prepared 3 options for formal resolution." I handed them a document prepared with my attorney. Option 1, I purchased the original materials outright for $45,000, reflecting their value before restoration. Option 2, you purchase my restoration work for $178,000, reflecting the added value my expertise contributed. Option 3, we donate the collection to the Textile Heritage Foundation, with joint attribution, providing both of you with a significant tax benefit. Their startled expressions reflected the new reality. I was no longer asking for permission or recognition. I was establishing clear terms for my expertise. "We'll need time to consider these options," Daniel said finally. "Of course," I replied. "My attorney will be available to answer any questions." After they left, I returned to my work table, where a new project was taking form, a commissioned piece for a collector who had seen my exhibition. Unlike the projects at Prestige, this commission came with my name prominently featured in the contract, with clear attribution requirements for any future display. The doorbell rang once more. This time it was Margot, arriving for our weekly dinner, a tradition we'd established after the exhibition. She entered without ceremony, already unwinding her scarf. "So, how did it go with the stepchildren?" she asked, setting down a bottle of wine. "They're considering their options," I replied with a small smile, "though I suspect they'll choose the tax deduction." Margot laughed. The sound warm and appreciative. Look at you setting boundaries like a woman who knows her worth. Later that evening, after Margot had gone, I returned to my studio. On my work table lay correspondence from 3 museums requesting conservation consultations, 2 colleges asking me to lecture on textile authentication, and a publisher interested in a book about my documentation techniques. Beside these opportunities sat a small, worn leather journal, my first documentation volume from 32 years ago. I opened it carefully, running my fingers over the pages that had transformed from private record keeping to historical evidence to valued artifact. The Metropolitan had offered to purchase my entire journal collection for their permanent archives, but I'd negotiated for them to remain in my possession during my lifetime, with a planned donation after my death. These journals were more than documentation. They were the physical embodiment of my reclamation journey. As I sat alone in my studio, surrounded by evidence of my new life, I allowed myself a rare moment of private reflection. I thought of all I had lost in pursuit of invisibility. The years spent shrinking myself, the creativity stifled, the recognition denied. There was sorrow there, but not regret. Every stitch had led me here. I moved to the large picture window that now dominated my studio wall, looking out at the garden I'd begun replanting. Where once there had been only my husband's preferred formal hedges, there now grew a vibrant mixture of textile dye plants, indigo, madder, weld, and woad. Their colors and textures a living extension of my work. At 58, I wasn't approaching the end of my creative life as my stepchildren had once implied. I was beginning a new chapter with decades of productivity ahead. My latest commission lay partially completed on my loom, a piece using my signature techniques, but with bold color combinations I'd never been allowed to explore at Prestige. I no longer covered my hands with gloves, no longer hunched my shoulders to appear smaller, no longer softened my voice to avoid attention. The physical transformation mirrored the internal one. I occupied space differently now, moved through the world as someone visible, consequential, entitled to recognition. That night, I worked late on my new commission. My hands moved with sure, practiced motions, the same hands that had created beauty in invisibility for decades, now creating beauty in full acknowledgement. The ache in my wrist that had been a constant companion had diminished significantly since I'd begun working on my own terms, designing for my own physical comfort rather than corporate efficiency. The next morning, I received an email from a young textile student asking if I would consider mentoring her. "Your story changed how I see my future in this industry," she wrote. "I want to learn not just your techniques, but how to value my own contributions from the beginning." I replied immediately with an invitation to visit my studio. The invisible threads that had connected generations of textile artists, predominantly women whose contributions had been systematically minimized, were finally becoming visible. My story was becoming part of a larger pattern of reclamation. As the sun rose higher, illuminating my workspace, I placed my palm flat against the emerging design on my loom, feeling the texture beneath my fingertips. This was mine. Not just the physical piece, but the techniques, the vision, the attribution, the compensation. Mine in a way my work had never been before. I had spent 32 years creating masterpieces that bore other people's names. Now I would spend however many years I had left creating masterpieces that bore my own. The invisible supporting threads had become the celebrated centerpiece, not by changing their essential nature, but by finally being seen for what they had always been, the foundation that made everything else possible. Threads always tell the truth, and my truth was finally being told, woven not just into textile, but into history, no longer background, but foreground, no longer invisible, but unmistakably, undeniably seen.